Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be starting our coverage of the 2018 St. Louis Rapid and Blitz tournament, part of the 2018 Grand Chess Tour, and all 9 competitors from the Grand Chess Tour this year are competing in this tournament. There is one wild card that's going to be Grandmaster Dominguez. If you're not familiar with this format, we play 27 rounds of chess over the next week. A lot of chess for these players. There's going to be 9 rounds of rapid chess. Both of these formats are fast chess, meaning you don't have a lot of time for the entire match. Rapid is going to be 25 minutes on your clock. You get 10 seconds starting on move 1 for every move that you make. For the Blitz portion, they're going to play 18 games of Blitz. You get 5 minutes on your clock and 3 seconds per move starting on move 1. We will try to have as much coverage of each round as possible, but there's a lot of rounds each and every day. At the end of commentary for each of these games, I will give an overview, a recap of each of those rounds. If you want to stay up to speed, you can watch these videos, or I'll have a link below of the official website of this tournament. So if you want to follow along there as well, you can also watch live streams of this event. But in round 1 here, playing the white pieces, we have Anand, and his opponent playing the black pieces, we have Nakamura. Vichy starts out with pawn to e4, pawn e5 from Nakamura, knight to f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, getting into the Ruy Lopez, and as we've seen more often than not, the Berlin defense with knight to f6, pawn to d3, and then bishop to c5. Usually going to see bishop to c5 or pawn to d6. Nakamura opting for a bishop to c5. Castle on the king side. Knight down to d4, attacking this bishop here on b5. Anand decides to go ahead and exchange in the center of the board. Pawn to c3, kicking the bishop back here to b6. And now white has a few options. You have your normal pawn to d4. That's one of the reasons you put your pawn here on c3 is to push forward in the center of the board. You can play bishop to g5, pinning down the knight to the queen. You can play queen to e2. White decides to go ahead and play knight to a3, preparing for knight to c4, attacking the bishop up here on b6. And so we see black play pawn to c6. Does two things. One, it kicks this bishop back. It also opens up the door for this dark square bishop to come to c7 as a safe haven once the knight comes to c4. So we see the bishop come back to a4, pawn to d6. Black could have also castled on the king side. Knight to c4, and then the bishop's going to fall back here to c7. Now bishop to b3, and you see this many times. Once black has solidified his pawn chains on these dark squares, bring the bishop here to b3, something Bobby Fischer used to do quite often, and just have it hang out here. Really put a lot of pressure on your opponent's king side of the board, this f7 square in particular. The only piece that's defending it right now is the king, so white looking to add pressure to that, especially in a rapid game where there's not a lot of time. You tend to find your opponents in some tough spots because they don't have a lot of time to analyze really all the certain variations that they would like to. Pawn to h6, stopping the bishop coming to g5. Knight comes back here to e3, just preparing to come to the king side of the board. It came here to c4 to attack the bishop, but decided not really do anything right now. A lot of pawns stopping my advancement, so I'm going to bring it to the king side of the board. Pawn to d5, pawn takes, pawn recaptures, pawn up here to d4, and then pawn down here to e4. And we'll kind of stop and look at this position right here. Black's done a good job of squeezing white. There's not a lot of places where white can really go right now. There's a backward pawn here on d5, so that is something that black has to worry about, just keeping a lot of his material defending that square. You always want to be defending and attacking white. Black's going to be defending this square. Both sides do have the bishop pair. I'd say both sides are fairly equal in the board states. White does need to be wary about these pawns pushing forward, but there's ways to counter this. One of the ways is just to play pawn to f3, and you tend to see this a lot in rapid style where you always want to have a defense in front of your king, but especially in these fast games, players are a little faster to push pawns in front of their kings because they know that it's really a matter of who's going to make a big mistake, and they're not going to put their king in some crazy position. And so as long as they can just whatever's in front of them right now, and that right now is this pawn on e4, if they can get rid of that, they're usually in an okay spot. Queen comes down here to d6. Pawn to g3, since black is threatening, the queen comes down here to h2, and it's being defended with some extra protection with the bishop here on c7. White is forced to play pawn to g3 and stop that attack. Now Nakamura decides to go ahead and take this opportunity to castle on the king side. Anand decides to go ahead and break up the center since he did have a cramped position, as we talked about. Pawn recaptures, and then the knight comes up here to f5, attacking the queen. Now, black has a few options as far as how he could continue. Decides to go ahead and bring his bishop down and capture right here. White now does have the bishop pair where black does not. If you kind of look back and say, did black have to do this? Well, no, he didn't, but he couldn't play something like queen to a6 if he's trying to hold on to his bishop here, because knight up here to e7 check, that is going to fork the bishop. The bishop's going to fall. Now, if we come back, we could see the queen move back, but has to be careful. Does not want to move to queen to d7 because really wants to have a defender on this knight to f6. The reason for that is the knight can come here to h6, check, and the pawn can't take because the knight is going to be left undefended. The rook can come up here. You can see how different this is if black decided to just play queen up here to d8. Now you're not going to see the knight take here because the pawn can take. The knight's being defended by the queen up here on d8. So could have, if he wanted to, played queen to d8, and then queen to e2 makes logical sense from white. But instead, in the game, decides to go ahead and take the knight with the bishop. Rook comes up here, and then rook over here to e8. And I think this is a mistake from Nakamura. If we look at what white is trying to do here, the next phase of attack is to attack this knight here on f6. And so having more defenders right now is what black should be worried about. Bishop to d8 makes a lot of sense. What he doesn't want to do is exactly what he did, and that is to trap his rook here on f8 because it can't go anywhere. The issue with that is now white has the option of coming to f4. This is forcing the queen to move. Once the queen moves, then we could just see the rook take on f6. If the pawn takes, then bishop coming up here to h6, and this rook is trapped. It's going to fall. White's going to have a very, very easy game after this. Now, what was just as surprising as rook coming over here to e8 is that Anand did not play bishop to f4. He played bishop to e3. But luckily for him, Nakamura played, about as good of a move as his last one. He played pawn to h5. Don't really think this helps him at all. If anything, this allows for white to execute his plan easier, because now the bishop comes to f4. The queen's forced to move. Doesn't really matter where it moves. It's going to come off the defense for this knight here. The rook takes on f6. The pawn takes. The bishop takes here on c7. Then after the queen take, this queen comes up here to h5. With only a few minutes left on the clock, very tough for black to really calculate how to continue here. He doesn't have any of his major material over on the king side of the board, and he's facing down a pretty aggressive queen here. He decides to go and push with his pawn e3, but then queen to g6 is just really tough to deal with. You can see this bishop on b3 is coming back to haunt black as this pawn is pinned down, and he can't move it because that would be an illegal move here. So nice little way for white to gobble up some more material here. King to h8, queen takes on f6, check as well. King moves. You can just do that same thing over again. It's just difficult to have to worry about the fact that you can't move that pawn. It's being pinned down. King to h8, now queen to h6. Difference of the move, now the bishop comes down here to c2, preparing for queen to h7 checkmate. There's no real good way to deal with this. We see pawn to f5. This is really just trying to save the game as much as possible. Now bishop to b3, so removing that defender here on f7. It gets a little tricky. No real way to deal with this except bringing the rooks involved into the game. We see rook over here to e1. Says, yeah, I can start to gobble up material on a different front. You still can't move your rook. It's pinned down. Black has no good moves here. Decides to bring his queen over here to e7, trying to double up on the e file. Queen to g6, check. King here to f8. And now white decides to go ahead and start exchanging material on the board. Black is forced to take with his queen. Bishop takes, and after the king takes, king to g2, and black is forced to resign. It's going to be easy for black or white to get his king involved into the game up here to f3. He can then take this material here on e3. The pawn can't come here because it would just fall to the pawn here on g3. So white would be up too much material going into the very end game. And Nakamura also just didn't have a ton of time at the end there. So congratulations to Vichy Anand. You never know what to expect in these long formats with 27 games, rapid style. You could tell early on neither side was doing anything too crazy. But then Vichy Anand found an opportunity and capitalized on it and got the victory. Now for the recap of round one, because we'll be trying to choose at least one game from most of the rounds. But for the other rounds, we did see Shakir Mamedov, he beat Wesley So, and then Fabiano Caruana, he beat Alexander Grishuk. Those three players got a victory in game one, along with Vichy Anand, as we saw, being the other three. So they are tied going into round two, but they started 30 minutes after they ended round one. So they are getting in a few rounds each day, and then once they get into the Blitz section, I believe it's 9 rounds each day. Just a lot of chess, since they are very, very fast games. So hopefully you guys are excited about this tournament. Always fun to see the top level players playing fast games, because they don't have hours to look over and make the best move every time. It's really just your instincts kick in. You have to go with things you've learned over the years of what feels best right now. And so it's interesting to see how that translates from some of the openings we've seen over time, different variations, and how they can actually use those and then go for victory, as we saw Anand from here. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in a future round of the Rapid and Blitz tournament in St. Louis.